beginning in verse 15. We, who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law no flesh shall be justified. But if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not frustrate the grace of God, for if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain.
We, Yehudim, by nature, and not of the nations, sinners, knowing that a man is not declared right by works of Torah, but through belief in Yahushua Messiah, even we have believed in Messiah, Yahushua, in order to be declared right by belief in Messiah, and not by works of Torah. Because by works of Torah no flesh shall be declared right. And if while seeking to be declared right by Messiah, we ourselves also are found sinners, is Messiah then a servant of sin? Let it not be. For if I rebuild what I once overthrew, I establish myself a transgressor. For through Torah I died to Torah in order to live to Elohim. I have been impaled with Messiah, and I no longer live, but Messiah lives in me. And that which I now live in the flesh, I live by belief in the Son of Elohim, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the favor of Elohim. For if righteousness is through Torah, then Messiah died for naught. So we backed up to verse 15 and 16, even though we covered that last session, just to give clarity through the thought. And again, just to reiterate that I could put in the place of the phrase by works of Torah, it would be more understandable for people today if I would insert by going to church.
Right.
Or by being religious. Because traditional Christianity has to admit that it has its own standards. It has those things that are required. It has observances that you must, if you're a true Christian, observe and participate in. Many believe to not, for example, observe Christmas in December on the 25th, also excludes that same person from being able to call themselves a true Christian. Even though history and the scriptures themselves bear witness that that is not when he was born.
Amen.
Nevertheless, it has become one of those very important observances. No true Christian would skip Easter. And yet, Easter, as, again, history, its origins, definition, all of the things that you can find on your own by doing your own research, proves that any observance called Ishtar or Ashtaroth or Eostra is pagan.
Right.
Having nothing to do with the truth of the impalement of the Passover of the Lamb of Yahweh. And I refer to him by, I believe, his given name, Yahushua, and he is the anointed one, the Messiah.
Amen. Well, just was considering, as I read from the King James Version and you read from the Scriptures, and the obvious difference. And what's being elevated in the King James is the name Jesus and his, that he is the Christ, which is so far removed from the Messiah foretold by the prophets all the way back to Moshe or Moses, that it makes it easy to make that jump into these pagan practices. Even considering Christmas, Christ Mass, there's the connection there. Yahushua, the Messiah, Again, that's our best understanding of his name to pronounce it Yahusha. Some people believe Yeshua, but we know it's not Jesus. And we know that
Because he wasn't Greek.
he was not Greek, and he was not Christos. He was the Messiah, foretold. And so one of the main things is to come out of these terms that are incorrect. There's no other way to put it. They're wrong. Into who he really was, and because the character of who he really is versus the one that's been attributed to this one that's called Jesus Christ, they're like totally opposed to one another.
Because, the character that's been attributed to this Jesus the Christ is that he did away with the law, that he fulfilled it so that his followers didn't ever have to worry about it or concern themselves about it. That is a false report. That's false doctrine. He fulfilled it to prove that he was sinless.
Amen.
But he didn't, and we've talked about this before, and he couldn't fulfill, because he didn't murder, he couldn't fulfill me and my choice to commit murder, or adultery, or not observe the Sabbath, etc., or to take the true name into vanity. He could do that for himself to prove who he was. I must also. Here's the key. The last verse of this chapter, in verse 21, Shaul says, I do not set aside the favor of Elohim, for if righteousness is through just being religious, or just going to church, or just obeying the commands because I have to, then Messiah died for nothing, is what Shaul says.
Right.
The true favor that Shaul is referring to, in your scriptures, it refers to it as grace, comes from the Greek word, charis, which means the divine influence upon the heart that produces the reflection of that divine influence as seen through the life. So Shaul is saying, I don't set aside the divine influence of the set-apart spirit in my life. I'm not doing that. I'm actually, by that power, walking in the truth of his covenant. And again, we've looked at the difference between being under the law and under or in covenant. And just again, for the sake of example, for maybe a new listener, two people commit to marriage. They make vows before an audience. They exchange those vows. They get a license in this state to marry. And so they have performed a legal act as well as a ceremonial and a covenant act. And as long as they abide by the terms of that covenant, then they're not under the jurisdiction of the law. But when one of them, either of them, or both of them break the vows, divorce, now it becomes a civil judiciary decision. Now the jurisdiction has been, once again, to clarify, is now under the law. And so what Shaul is saying in comparison is that when I walk in the covenant, I'm not under the jurisdiction of the law.
Right.
Even though my walk in the covenant looks like a person who is keeping the law, in other words, observing the things not that traditional Christianity observes by its code of ethics and its code of rules, but by the standards as set forth in the scriptures, in Leviticus 23, for example. So it's very convenient if you do away with Leviticus 23 and its relevance for the believer today to convince that same believer that now you must keep this set of rules, these observances, these holy days or holidays, these things that are accepted in your religion. And so what a lot of people do, and that's why you see a lot of people coming to church on Easter that don't ever come to church any other time, is they do that out of obligation. They do that to simply satisfy maybe their own conscience, but it's not because they want to, or else they would be in fellowship every time there's a fellowship opportunity.
Amen.
So what Shaul is painting here on this page is not the doing away with the one in favor of just following Jesus any way that he wants me to follow. I've heard people actually say things like that.
Right.
Well, I'm not under the law like you are. I don't have to keep the Sabbath or eat according to the scriptures or observe, the observances that are in the scriptures. I can do it any way that I want because I'm under grace. That sounds to me like that person in that mindset is living under what they call grace, but use as a license to sin. And that's exactly what Shaul says in verse, for example, in verse 17. If while seeking to be declared right by Messiah, we ourselves also are found sinners, and we know that sin is identified in the commandments. So the breaking of the commandments is what constitutes the definition for sin. So he says, we ourselves also are found sinners. Is Messiah then a servant of sin? In other words, by walking in this covenant, according to his word, walking imperfectly, not like Messiah who was perfect.
Right.
But walking imperfectly, we realize we still sin. Does that mean that we then are doomed to live in sin, even in Messiah? No. There's the beauty of 1 John chapter 1, that now, instead of offering a blood sacrifice according to the book of the law, we acknowledge the sacrifice of the impalement of the Lamb of Yahweh. Yahushua is his name, I believe, and appropriating that sacrifice, I come to him as my great high priest by faith and confess my sin. That's what 1 John 1 says. And he, in return, is faithful and just to forgive me of my sins and cleanse me from all unrighteousness. So the requirements, the process has not changed, but the application of it has changed. That's why we don't do blood sacrifice, for heaven's sakes. We don't do blood sacrifice because the blood sacrifice has been made.
Amen. The Lamb of Yahweh.
But a lot of people say, well, you're doing the same thing with walking in the commands. And I asked them, so it's okay to kill? It's okay to murder? It's okay to commit adultery? It's okay to lie? It's okay to cheat? It's okay to steal? It's okay to dishonor your parents? It's okay to rip people off? It's okay to covet your neighbor's wife? It's okay to defame the creator of the universe? I believe his name is Yahweh. It's okay to do that, to bring his name to nothing. It's okay to do that. It's okay to set aside what he set aside as the day that is set apart, and he called it that day of rest, or that Shabbaton, or that Sabbath, Shabbat, that it's okay for me to do that because I follow your Jesus? How ridiculous is that when you really look at it in that kind of a comparison?
Well, exactly. And then, when you consider that a statement that you alluded to has been made to each of us and others who believe in, that Torah is for us today, that, we're following Torah in order to earn salvation or something like that. And we were talking about this last week, that the following of Torah is not religious duty. When we go to, as you talked about in 1 John 1, when we go to him confessing our sin, that's not out of duty. That comes from a heart that wants to walk in the truth and realizes that you've fallen short. So there's a desire to walk in the truth. The evidence of that is repentance.
Yeah.
The evidence of that is that we are desiring to walk in the truth, and we're about doing it. So it's kind of like the marriage situation you were talking about. If you go into that marriage situation that the terms of the covenant are duty to you, you're just looking for a time when you're going to be able to step out from
when you're off duty.
Yeah, you're going to end up at some point breaking the terms of the covenant because it's not out of love.
I think I just touched on something that actually is an answer to something that I've always considered, because I've talked with so many people over the years who don't go to any kind of fellowship because of the hypocrisy that they see in the lives of those who profess to be Christians or religious. I just realized it's because they're off duty. If they're doing it out of duty, and they just come together on Sunday, which is, I prefer not to refer to the day that's dedicated to the sun, S-U-N, because that is in opposition to the word of Yahweh. But they do because they meet on that day. If that's the only day that their religion is intact, that's the day that they're on duty.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing it out of duty, so they're on duty. Then comes the next day. They call it Monday. It's a day dedicated to the moon. Through Friday, it's a day dedicated to the fish god. But during those days, they're off duty. They're not in their religious mindset. They're off duty, so they just live the way that they really want to live.
That's a picture.
I think there's a picture there.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Shaul is referring to, that it's not by works, not by the duty of keeping the commands. And I'm not just talking about or referring to folks that aren't observing the commands as we understand them in a like-mindedness as our own. I'm talking also, including also people that we may even fellowship, that the only reason that they gather on Sabbath is because they have to.
Right.
That the only reason that they give their tithe is because they have to. That the only reason that they, do anything in a religious mindset is because they have to. Those folks are in the same works-oriented mindset.
So they're under the law.
Because they're acting like, and they're living like, and they're expressing a life like one that is out of duty instead of in covenant.
Amen. It's there's a portion of Scripture I thought of a bit ago. It says in, it's Romans chapter 8, picking up in verse 3. For the Torah being powerless in that it was weak through the flesh, Elohim having sent his own Son in the likeness of sin, concerning sin, condemned sin in the flesh, so that the righteousness of the Torah should be completed in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So the Spirit that works in the life of a true believer, who the evidence is the desire to walk in that. And that's not something that we pull up our bootstraps and get about doing. That's something that happens by our yielding, our submission to the work of the Spirit.
It happens supernaturally in your heart and mind. You think differently, you act differently, you talk differently.
A new creation.
You exemplify what has taken place, and that is a new creation. You don't study to be a new creation.
Amen.
We don't go to Bible studies with the goal and the intention of attaining some righteous state. We either are born again by His Spirit and have been the recipients of an imputed righteousness, or we are under the law trying to work ourselves to a satisfaction that may be a personal satisfaction, or it may be a common satisfaction among those that we hang out with. Okay, so we can hang out with you because you've attained the same status of satisfaction in your works-based religion as I have, and they try to call that fellowship. Fellowship is a spiritual experience. It is not a place that you go. It is not a group that you hang out with. It is a communion with the Creator of the universe that has been extended to you through the Spirit of the Creator of the universe, sent into your life to bear witness with your spirit that you are not just naturally living now, but you are supernaturally, by the Spirit, by faith, living because of the resurrection of the Lamb of Yahweh.
Amen.
Yahushua is his name. And so that's why when Shaul says in verse 18 here, for if I rebuild what I once overthrew, in other words, if he reestablishes any form of lawlessness into this covenant relationship, I establish myself a transgressor. That's why he says that. He says, if I rebuild what I once overthrew, and that was the lawlessness that he lived in, came out of, entered into a relationship with the Messiah, supernatural, filled by his Spirit.
Amen.
And he's saying, if I rebuild what I once overthrew in that lawlessness, I establish myself a transgressor, a breaker of the very covenant that I profess to be involved in. It's a verse like this that cause folks to think that that's what we've done.
Right.
That we've gone back under the law, they say,
Mm-hmm.
when we once were by grace receiving the Spirit.
Yeah, they say we've fallen from grace.
It's exactly backwards.
Mm-hmm.
We were already in lawlessness when we were rejecting, and you made a reference to that we follow the Torah. And you and I, we talk a language because we have a common understanding. But for the sake of the listeners, let me clarify that for them. We believe that the Messiah is and was the living Torah.
Amen.
The living instruction, the living commandment, the living law, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
personified. So when I say I follow Torah,
Amen.
I'm not looking back at a list of commandments as goals that I need to achieve to have some standard of righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm referring to following the living Torah.
Amen.
Because his Spirit is alive, and he gives me the commentary. He gives me the instruction. He gives me the how-to.
Mm-hmm.
He gives me the want-to.
Yeah.
The
power to.
And the power to.
Mm-hmm.
He is my all in
Amen.
all. So we're not talking about going back. You know, people have started putting the commandments on gravestone appearing banners and signs and
big rocks out at the intersection.
big rocks and various things. No, those things, according to the Scriptures, if you're born of the Spirit, they're on your heart.
Amen.
They're in your mind. And you don't have to take, my word for that. I mean, it's the identification, we've talked about it numerous times, it's the definition of the new covenant.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many people today that have no clue of what the new covenant, where it came from, what it's all about, what it means to them. But from the prophet Ezekiel, I'll read it again because you can't read this enough. Yahweh is speaking in verse 26 of chapter 36, Ezekiel, I shall give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I shall take the heart of stone, the gravestone concept, out of your flesh and shall give you a heart of flesh, living.
Mm-hmm.
It will be alive.
Amen.
And put my spirit within you, and I shall cause you to walk in my laws and guard, observe, keep my right rulings, and shall do them. Period.
Mm-hmm.
There is a concise definition of what takes place in a new covenant believer's life.
Amen. Well, you were talking about people thinking that we're doing, what Shaul, what Paul says, if I rebuild that, what I've overthrown. I think what causes people to think that is because they realize that Shaul came out of for lack of a better word, a Torah observant group of people.
Yeah, and they weren't.
He was involved in Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you consider what you just read from Ezekiel, that promise was given to people who were of like mind as Shaul,
Mm-hmm.
who were believing that they were walking in the commandments of Torah, but they were doing it by their own understanding, their own additions to, subtractions from, fences they set forth to be able to walk in it. The difference is that Torah then being written on the heart isn't out of that. It's within the covenant, and it's out of love, and it's because of what he does. And that's the real difference. It's the administration of Torah from being outwardly with men to becoming inwardly by the power of the Spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, what Yah has done is he's given us witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
He says that if you're born of his Spirit comes into your life. His Spirit bears witness with your spirit that you are a child of Yahweh.
Amen.
There's a witness. He also gives the witness of his written word. So the commandment that's written on your heart and mind will not deviate
Amen.
from what is written. So there's the second witness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the third witness that really matters is what Messiah is going to say to each person when he sees him and her face to face.
Yeah.
The third witness will be either enter in, good and faithful servant. That means a good by the essence of the Spirit of Yah, because in us there dwells no good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And faithful means believing the truth
Mm-hmm.
of Yah by the set apart Spirit. Enter in, good and faithful servant.
A doer.
Someone, there's one option in that third witness. The other witness is, depart from me. I never knew you. You never knew me.
Mm-hmm.
You thought you knew me, but I never knew you. There's the commentary on that statement. Depart from me. And the real key word in that is, you who work lawlessness.
Wow.
Lawlessness, not you who work legalism. That's what people who observe the commandments are called by people who don't observe the commandments. They call us, or anyone like us, legalists.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth of it is, he is going to say to those who do not observe his commands, his right ruling, his Torah, his instruction, his teaching, depart from me, you who work lawlessness.
Amen. Now that comes from the Messiah himself
Himself.
in Matthew chapter 7.
Yep.
And with that, I think that's something that people need to really consider. The things that we're talking about are encapsulated in that by the very Messiah who came for the express purpose to say, you've heard all of this stuff that's been said, but I say to you.
That's right.
And which is the premise of this entire show.